Last time we were looking at the use of the yield return statement, and we looked at a few ways it can be used when you've got to write your own enumerator, so your own implementation of the IEnumerator interface, when you're dealing with enums and you want to go through a subset of enums, or when you're dealing with mathematical sequences. All of that was available actually in C# version 2, but what we're going to look at now is the new use of yield return that came in much more recently in C# 8, and how we can use it for actually managing asynchronous sequences and asynchronous for each loops. So what I've got here, just to demo that, in this program, I've got a typical situation of where we're putting together a collection, but acquiring the data may take some amount of time. Now here, I've just simulated the delay by using this task.delay, though I'll show you in a moment a more realistic situation where the data is coming in from a web service, so you've really got no control over what's happening. But what I've done, I've got this create list async, and we've got a list of items, and all we do is loop through 1 to 10 and add that item to the list, but to pretend it's slow, we're going to have a delay. And because of that, it's got an await, it's an async function. And then when I actually use that, here's my for each loop. And because create list async is an async function, I await it. And that means that the program will be able to carry on and do something else in the meantime. So we'll see here that when we run this up, because we've got the await in there, it's got a wait on the very first call. And so although it's only a 1 second delay on each one of the iterations around the loop, we can see it took actually 10 seconds to come out. But then when I print a timestamp with each one of them, you can see that they came out very quickly, all in one go. Now that's actually not necessarily a very good way of doing things, because we're waiting until the last element of the list has been processed before we start dealing with the first one. And as I say, particularly if these were coming in from some external source, we don't necessarily want to wait. We want to start processing the first one as soon as it comes in, and therefore we're not wasting time waiting for the last one. And that's where this new feature in C# 8 comes along, because what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this create list async and I'm going to copy it, but I'm going to rename it create async list. The naming conventions are still a bit unsettled about this, so don't always follow this, but you'll see why I've called it create async list there, because the other thing I'm going to do, it's still going to be an async function, but I'm going to return not a task and not an IEnumerable. This is a new interface that has come in C# 8, which is the IAsyncEnumerable. In fact, we've got 3 related interfaces that have come in. IAsyncEnumerable, as you'll probably guess, IAsyncEnumerator. So remember from the earlier videos, this very close relationship between IEnumerable and IEnumerator. And then the third one that's come in is IAsyncDisposable. The reason for that being, if you remember from the earlier videos, that IEnumerator implements IDisposable, so IAsyncEnumerator has to implement IAsyncDisposable. But we're just going to worry about this IAsyncEnumerable. So that's what we've got there. And then the other change we make, we don't build up the list as we go along. We actually don't need to store our own list at all. We just once again, having done the await deliberately for the delay, we, just like in the previous video, we say yield return, and then our value, which in this case is just going to be I. So just like we saw before, if you had a method, in that case that returned an IEnumerable of int, then you could do a yield return of int. But also we've got this async and the IAsyncEnumerable. So having written the function to actually do the work, we've also got the function showListAsync that displayed the results. So what I'm going to do is copy that, and once again, similar name change, showListAsync becomes showAsyncList. And then, of course, as well as create list async, it's going to be create async list. But then the little bit of magic that I really think shows how this works, I'm going to take that await keyword and I'm going to move it to apply it to the actual for each statement. So in the older one, we did the await create list async. We basically awaited the function to get the results back from the list. We're awaiting effectively that call to get enumerator, and that's why we had the full 10 seconds delay right back at the beginning. Here though, when we've got our async list, we await on the for each loop. And so if I now put that in there, and let's change the actual statement here. But now if we run it up, we see two things. Firstly, we get the first result in much quicker. We don't have to wait 10 seconds. But now we can see, looking at the timestamp and just looking at the delay, that each one of the results is coming in after 1 second. So overall, it's still taking exactly the same amount of time to do it. It's still taking 10 seconds because we're looping 10 times and we've got this delay of 1,000 milliseconds. But it's a much better way of doing it because we get the results coming in as soon as they're available, and any processing we have to do, we can do straight away. Or indeed, just in terms of not having the user having to twiddle their thumbs, it's just a much more friendly experience. So that's what we have with the IAsyncEnumerable. We do a yield return, and once again, it just keeps going in there, coming back just like the yield return before, but in this case, it's actually doing it in an asynchronous way. That's a bit of an abstract example. I think it's quite useful because you can see two simple examples side by side, see how they're working differently. But more realistically, this is the sort of thing you want to do when the delay, whatever it may be, is not something that you can control. So it's not the fact that it's a slow process in our processor, it's actually the fact that it's someone completely different that we're having to wait for, and therefore there probably is lots we can do in the meantime while we're waiting for their results. And so what I've done here is put together a web service, and here, going back to the examples we've seen before of books, I've got this book controller, and so I've got just a model called book with a title, a genre and a rating, and then we've just thrown together some test data in a static list there, and you can get all of the books, but also what I've put in here is the ability to get recommendations for a particular genre. So we've got thrillers, we've got SF, we've got horror, we've got classics, and so what happens here is when somebody asks for recommendations for a particular genre, we go through, get hold of all of the books in that genre, and then get hold of all of the books which have the highest rating. And what that's going to do, in some cases, it might just give us the one book. So if we look at the highest rating, say for thrillers, then that's just going to be Goldfinger because that's the only one that's got a rating of 5. But if we look at it for horror, then we're going to get back a couple of results because we've got 2 equal ones. So we're going to have that result to return back. Nothing particularly fancy there, but I've, again, because this isn't going to be slow, but for emulating the delay that we might have, I've put in a sleep of 1,000 in there. If we then look at the client for this, so let's change actually the startup here for multiple startup. So I want to start up both our client and our web service. And if we look at our client, I've got a program here and I've got a get all function. So that's just going to return all of those books. And then I've also got a get recommendations. But the thing to notice here is the get recommendations takes a list of genres. So although the recommendations here is just for a single genre, if you want multiple ones, you can put them in there. But the only way that it can do that is to loop through your genres, and it makes a separate call to that recommendations for each genre in turn. So here we've got a slightly more realistic example of the situation we had before, that it's going to have a 1 second delay every time we call this recommendations. If we're calling it multiple times in a loop, we want to make the choice. Do we want to have all of those delays at the beginning and then get all the results in one go? Or would it be better, and I think it would be, to get the results as quickly as possible and spread the delay across the whole thing? So what we're doing here initially is we're doing this probably the slow way, the old-fashioned way. I am just getting the recommendations and loading them into a list, and then it won't be until we've got all the recommendations that we see the results. So here, if I ask for both horror and SF, and then run that up, you'll notice I've put in a little press when ready because we've got to wait till the web service runs up when we're doing multiple startups. And so there it's saying press when ready. There we can see our server's started up. So if I do press when ready, it takes a bit of a delay, probably more than 2 seconds because it had to make the connection as well. But we saw that all of those results came back in one go, so the delays accumulated. So we've got 2 horrors, Frankenstein and 12, and then we've got 1 science fiction. Not exactly what we wanted. So if we then just make the same changes we did before, we don't need to touch the web service, but what I'm going to do is just change this so it's no longer returning an IAsyncEnumerable, it's returning an IAsyncEnumerable. And so we don't need to put together the list for ourselves, we just need to take these books. Now, a slight little problem we've got to look at here is that when we get the data back from the web service, it is itself an enumerable. So remember we saw if there are 2 books with equal ratings, then we're going to get them back as a collection. So what we actually do here is the books we've got back there as an IAsyncEnumerable, we then have to do another loop through that. So let's say for each var b in books, and then in that loop we can do our yield return. And remember, we're not returning the full book, we're just returning the title, so we can return b.title in there. And so you can see, we can get rid of, obviously, that. And so you can see that although it's a nested loop, it's still going to hit that yield return a number of times, remember where it is, and then come back again. And so now we just shift the position of the await once again. So now we're awaiting the loop rather than awaiting the call, and we'll run that one up again. So we can see there that our web service is ready. We'll hit return. Still a bit of a delay, but we saw that we got the 2 horrors through very, very quickly because they came back in one go. So even though we were doing the yield return there, this loop will actually go through very, very fast because there's no delay on it. But then when we got back the science fiction recommendation, let's just look at it again. That's when we got the delay because it had to wait the 1 second. So if this was a lot of data coming in from a web service that we needed to do some processing on, we want to get at it as soon as possible, do the processing as soon as the first results come in, because it's not our delay, we're not going to be using up any resources that will slow things down anymore. So we start processing as they come in, we don't have to wait for them all to come back. So that was the second use of yield return, the new one in C#8 with our IAsyncEnumerable. Not actually using IAsyncEnumerable, but using a very closely related interface. I think I've said everything I can think of to say on IAsyncEnumerable, but I've said that before. It's a fascinating interface. It's got so many features to it. So if there's anything you think about that you want to ask about it, any other comments you want to add, do pop them below, do subscribe. But next time, I hope I'll be talking about something totally unrelated, some other feature of object-oriented C# .NET development. See you then.